So g'day, it's Scott Gibbons here with Barnaby Health, and this is Everyday Greatness. And just being yourself sounds easy. It's what everybody just does without effort, or at least it should be. But a lot of people are afraid to show their vulnerabilities in the fear that other people will see it as a weakness. But our guest today, journalist Jessica Horner, has found success because of her vulnerabilities. Jessica was diagnosed with autism at 27, but she's also living with Ethlers Danlos syndrome, which is EDS, a heart condition, a history of complex mental health challenges, and PTSD, all things she used to try and hide from the world, thinking it made her look broken. And when she did open up about being a person with disability, however, her own world opened up in ways she'd never have expected. She appeared in a production about adult autism called A Rich New Lens, and she received a regional storyteller scholarship at the ABC in 2022. And she was nominated for a Walkley Foundation Media Diversity Australia Award in May 23, and she spent time on the selection panel at TEDx in Wagga Wagga. Jessica used to think her life was messy and broken. She used to hide it, thinking it was embarrassing to talk about it. But now that she's talking about it openly, it's given her a strength and an opportunity she never would have dreamt about when she was trying to be something she wasn't. The best place to hear Jessica's story is from Jessica herself. So it's an honour to welcome you, Jessica, to Everyday Greatness. How's your world today? Is it terrific?
Not too bad.
Okay. So on paper, you've got a disability, but in reality, you're a young Australian woman taking the world by storm. So let's focus on that. Why did you apply for the Regional Storyteller Scholarship at the ABC, and what were you hoping to get out of it?
Sure. I think it's easier to say, let's focus on the person and not the disability, but the scholarship that I applied for was a disability scholarship. It was for people with a disability who had content that they wanted to make with the ABC. And for me, it gave me a platform to tell stories of people who didn't usually have a voice. But more than that, it was the chance to start a conversation. And when I started at the ABC, autism was not a topic that was often talked about in terms of how we relate to autism in adults. We often talk about children and carers, and that's a very valid and important conversation, but it felt to me as though the autistic adult population was almost invisible. And so I kind of set out to have that conversation, to start that conversation of what is it that we mean when we say autistic adult, and how do we understand the experiences of autistic adults, because often they can be a bit of an enigma when we don't take the time to look at the nuance of how we live our lives.
Sure. How did your diagnosis come about at age 27? What was the reason that you went and found out that you had autism?
Yeah, so I went to get an autism assessment when I was 27, and I was very unwell at that stage. My mental health was very, very poor, and my physical health was pretty bad too. And as you mentioned, I have Ethlers Danlos syndrome, I have a heart condition and so on. And so those things were all impacting me at the time. But there was this constant sense of I don't fit in, I don't have a place in the world, and I don't know how I relate to the world. And so looking at an autism diagnosis was sort of a way of saying, okay, maybe this will make some sense. But unfortunately, I had been in such a place of distress that when I heard the word autistic said in the context of me as a formal diagnosis, my brain went, oh, you're not autistic, you're broken. Or your autistic is synonymous to broken. So they're the same thing. And it took me quite some time to get to that point where I not only accepted my diagnosis as autistic, but also celebrated it and went, this is something that is really, it's something I can embrace, and there is a culture and there is a whole subculture attached to being autistic that I can really tap into and find a sense of belonging. And I think the Regional Storyteller Scholarship at the ABC really gave me opportunity to connect with that community on a level that I otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to connect with.
Sure. So for 27 years, you allegedly had autism and nobody picked up on it?
I mean, I I remember being called quirky. I remember being called different. I remember being bullied at school and various other things happening over the years. But autism was not understood when I was growing up in the way that it is now. I was a child and teenager in the 90s and early 2000s, and a lot has changed in that time. What we understood autism to be 20 or 30 years ago is not what we understand it to be now. So
No.
I was probably 25 before I even considered the possibility that I was autistic. And, that was a very slow realization. It wasn't sort of like one day, I might be autistic out of the blue. It was something that really very gradually came about.
Because it's a whole spectrum. And then, so was it you that did the self-diagnosis to say, I'm going to go and get this checked? Was that you?
Yeah, I was the first one to recognise it, and it did take a little bit of convincing with my parents and even, some of my medical practitioners that it was worth looking into further. It's also something that's very problematically screened for. So I was actually tested for autism twice. I did a clinical trial test when I was 26 in 2018, I think, and they used a scale that was designed for children, and it was designed specifically for children who were male. And I scored about 1 or 2 points below the threshold for an autism diagnosis. And they said, you don't have autism, you're not autistic, you're just anxious. And so that was really quite discouraging because it was kind of like a denial of who I am. And it was a denial of what I was going through and how I was experiencing my world. And as a result of that, when I turned around a year later and got a second opinion and did get a diagnosis of autistic, it was jarring because I'd been subliminally told for so long that this was not a good diagnosis to get. This is something that people would tell me, are you sure you want that label? Or you're so normal, you don't need a diagnosis of autism, and things like that. And that's actually really problematic to say autism is something that is wrong with you. We look at it as a disorder when really it's a condition, it's a divergence, it's a different way of seeing the world. But disorder, no, I don't think it is a disorder, but I do think that, the way that we diagnose people can make people feel as though they are a disorder and that there's something wrong with them rather than just a difference in the way they think.
But that's very, very strong of you to have been misdiagnosed, if you will, where they used a male child test. Very strong of you to then say, no, hang on, I'm going back. I want it redone.
Yeah, it wasn't something that I did easily. I was encouraged a lot by my family, and my mental health was really bad, and I kind of got to that point where I went, I don't know if I even want this, but I need to have answers because I can't keep going the way I am. Unfortunately, the initial impact of getting a diagnosis as autistic was really quite negative. I actually attempted to take my own life only 3 or 4 weeks after I was diagnosed autistic, and that was for a range of reasons, but the autism diagnosis certainly played a part. And I actually remember not walking down the street, being pushed down the street in a wheelchair and thinking to myself, you're broken, there's something wrong with you, you have a broken brain. And so the messages that I've been given by the people around me well before I was diagnosed kind of cemented this idea in my brain, whether it was conscious or not, that autism was a bad thing and that being autistic was a bad thing. So it was kind of like this hesitant sort of tiptoe into a diagnosis, hoping that it might give me some answers. And in the end, it did. Actually, understanding that I was autistic changed my world in ways I never would have imagined. But at the time, it wasn't something that happened overnight.
So what was the impetus then that said, it's not bad, it's good?
I think following my suicide attempts, there was definitely a factor of, okay, this can't get any worse than it is now. So how can I look at this differently? But I think that was very, again, something that happened slowly.
Yeah.
And then I think over time, there was one TED talk that really stands out to me. It's called Everything You Know About Autism is Wrong, and it's by Jack Denhousing. And Jack Denhousing is actually in the article that you mentioned earlier, Rich Newlands as an expert. And it was really great to meet them and get to know a little bit about their work and who they were, because what they talked about in their TED talk was shifting paradigms and saying, we once thought the world was flat, And we now know differently. In the same way, we once thought autism was a tragedy, and now we know differently. So we need to embrace a paradigm shift. We need to embrace a different way of thinking about autism that is more positive. And I think that slowly set me on the path of going, okay, maybe this isn't such a bad thing, but it was probably another 6, 12, 18 months before I really got to that point of feeling confident in myself and saying, yes, I'm autistic, and yes, I am comfortable to tell people that. I am comfortable to acknowledge that to myself. I'm comfortable to acknowledge the benefits that come with that rather than just the things that maybe I struggle with.
It's a word, not a sentence.
Yes.
So good you. I think Barnaby's got some questions for you. I'm going to flick you across to Barnaby Houth right now. You happy with that?
Sure.
Good you.
I do. Hello, Jessica. Now,
Hi, how you going?
Very well, and yourself?
Not too bad.
Good to hear. A lot of people in your situation, when you face those huge challenges, the floor would fall out from under them and they'd think there's no way back. You got stronger. You are now a really powerful human being. You interviewed one of the strongest women in Australia, former Australian of the Year, Grace Tame. Was that an intimidating experience as a young journalist trying to find her way in the world?
Surprisingly, not as much as you might think. I think that, sure, Grace Tame is someone who is a remarkable person. She's intelligent, she's capable, she's ferocious in her pursuit of what she believes is right. And, that's really quite admirable. But at the end of the day, she's just a person. And, I had the chance to talk to her both on air and off as a person who is also autistic as well. So we have that same way of communicating, that same way of empathizing with our world. And so really what I look at Grace and see as someone who has faced enormous adversity and gone, okay, I can use this experience to change my world for the better. And I feel like whilst, Grace Tame is probably in a league of her own, I feel like that's a very similar mentality to what I've had to take on with my experiences, is say, you know what, really bad stuff happened and it sucked and it was really awful and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. However, I can use this experience to make sure that the next generation or even the next, person that comes along and reads my work perhaps has a slightly different view of themselves or someone they love or someone that they've met because of the way that I am willing to open up. And so I think, I admire Grace a lot. I think that she's someone to look up to for sure, but intimidating, no, probably not. I didn't really find it that intimidating because a person is a person is a person at the end of the day.
It's an incredible message, and I know there's probably a lot of people listening to you now that get really inspired by your positivity. Your lows were really low, but your highs, including the interview with Grace Tame, have been huge. You were recently nominated for a Walkley Award. How humbling was that when you look at it in comparison to where you were when you were at the depths of your challenges?
It was amazing, and I'm really honoured to have been in the company of people who have really made themselves household names in Australian media. And so that itself I remember the day that I was nominated, I said something that I'm not going to repeat on air, and then I burst into tears because I was overwhelmed. I wasn't expecting the nomination in the first place. The Walkley Foundation is sort of like, I look up to it as, the premier organisation for journalism excellence in Australia. And so to be acknowledged by that organisation was amazing. However, I think the more humbling part was to realise just the impact that my work had and the sheer distance that it had travelled. When I started at the ABC and when I started my project that would become A Rich New Lens, I wanted to help one person and I wanted to change a conversation. I decided that if one person walked away with this with a better sense of self, if one person walked away with this with a better understanding of someone that they loved or whatever it was they took away from it that was positive, then that was enough.
Yeah.
So everything else was kind of a bonus. It was something on top. So absolutely a humbling experience, absolutely something that was fantastic to go along to the awards. Even though I didn't win that award, I got to be in the company of some of the most talented young journalists in the country. So, I don't know how to quantify it beyond that, but it was an amazing experience. However, it was an icing on the cake experience. It wasn't necessarily something that was necessary in order to make the work that I'd done worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I think you quantified it very well. Now, just going back to you trying to get your message across to just one person, explain to that one person why you think authenticity is so important in today's world.
Why is authenticity important in today's world? I think, for one thing, it's very exhausting to be someone that you're not. At the end of the day, it can be quite damaging.
Yeah.
As an autistic person, I do something called masking or camouflaging, and that can be covering up autistic traits and trying to fit in a society where I am somehow different to the majority of people around me. And for many, many years I did that, and it took an enormous toll on my mental health. It took an enormous toll on my physical health. It took me to a really low place. And it made me more vulnerable to being taken advantage of and being put in situations where I was, treated in ways that I should not have been treated, whether that be bullying or abuse or something else. And so, authenticity has allowed me this freedom to just say, this is who I am and I will not apologize for it. It doesn't mean that I am rude or dismissive in the way that I go about interacting with other people. However, I do think that having that freedom to just say, this is who I am and I embrace it in my entirety, messy bits and all, because by showing people me in an authentic way, I might actually be able to show people a more real version of what it's like to be, a person, but, whether that's an autistic person or just a person in general. We see so much media these days that is focused on the highlights reel and the perfect photos and the special moments in life. Very rarely do we see, this is the moments where I was actually feeling pretty down and pretty low and like today I'm having a not great day. I mean, I said at the start it's okay, but really if I'm honest, I'm, having a bit of a hard time. I've got some stuff going on in my life that's stressing me out, and I could say, there's nothing wrong, but I don't think that would be authentic. So, I show up and I do my job and I try and be as positive as I can be. But, there's something powerful in saying to people, this is me when I'm not at my best. This is me when I'm, being my most authentic and real, but not necessarily my most shiny and positive, because it allows people to relate in a way that they otherwise wouldn't relate to the world.
I think there's a lot of people that do well to take your message to heart. It's a very nice way to put your days that aren't so great. Now, tell me a bit about your website, Spoonfuls of Whimsy. It seems to be an outlet for all of your creativity through photography and writing. Tell us about the website and what it offers visitors.
Spoonfuls of Whimsy started out as a small art business, and these days it is a transitional website as I move into a new sort of career space, and there will soon be a website that replaces it. Spoonfuls of Whimsy won't go anywhere necessarily as a place to display my art, my painting, my writing, my photography, when it's personal and when it's just an outlet for expressing myself in the world. But I think where I'm headed next is into the space of advocacy and advising people what experiences I've had as a person living with disabilities, and therefore how I can inform the conversation about people with disabilities on a national level, I hope, as well as on a local level and wherever it feels most relevant at the time, as well as continue my work in journalism and, continue to have those conversations that are difficult, as well as those conversations that sometimes are just important conversations to have, whether it's challenging personally or not. Sometimes there's just conversations that we need to have as a society. And I really value the times when people are willing to open up to me as talent, as me being a journalist, and give me something authentic and real themselves, because, it requires trust in order to do that. And it's very humbling to have people say, here's a part of my story rather, and I'm going to trust you to tell it in a authentic and meaningful way.
Yeah. So in today's society, a lot of people fear being vulnerable and real and authentic because they think it makes them look weak. Do you find joy in the fact that you've built a life for yourself that's full of huge achievements that 30-year veteran journalists would be jealous of? Do you find joy in the fact that you opened up to the world and admitted those vulnerabilities and have been your true self and you're reaping the benefits of it?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I find it difficult to quantify in words sometimes how much of a difference it's made to my life, but it's that ability to say, I'm not only going to be vulnerable, but I'm going to lean into that vulnerability. I'm going to lean into that feeling of discomfort, because there's something at the other side of it that is worthwhile. And the reward that came from, for example, opening up in my article and talking about my suicide attempt and talking about my relationship with my doctor and other people in the article was, yes, that's scary and there's an element of risk involved in that. But I was getting messages from people on the other side of the country, and even in different parts of the world, like different countries around the world, saying your story had an impact on me because X, or because, this happened and I better understand this thing over here. And, I don't think you can put a quantifiable descriptor upon how that feels to realize that you've actually impacted someone else's life. I had, people say to me, I have started to change the way that I think about autism in myself or in my family member. And, that's the sort of thing that I live for as a journalist. That's the sort of thing that I go, you know what, this makes every single risk I've ever taken worthwhile, because people actually can find benefit in what I do. And it's not just about me. It's not just about saying, oh, I've achieved these things. I mean, those things are nice, but those are like I said, it's the icing on the cake. It's not the be all and end all to get those acknowledgements. It's more having the platform to have conversations that matter and have conversations that actually impact other people's lives. So I think, yes, vulnerability is something that it can be challenging at times, but yes, there is also a very real joy involved in seeing the rewards of taking that risk.
Well, Jessica Horner, you said that your impact on people when they hear your story is unquantifiable, but I can quantify it. It's just bloody good. It's been bloody good chatting to you today. Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure chatting to a humble human being as they're taking the world by storm. Thank you for joining Scott and I.
No worries. Thanks.
And thank you also to the ARA Group for being our major sponsor for the 6th year in a row. And thank you all for listening. We hope we've helped make you feel proud again of just being an everyday Joe bag of donuts. Listen to Everyday Greatness next episode, where we'll continue today's conversation with Ellen Hester, the office admin at Down Syndrome New South Wales, who also has Down syndrome herself. And just by turning up to work every day, Ellen is helping show people with disability that they don't need to hide their vulnerabilities to be successful. We hope you can join us for that one. But if you want to find out more about this show, go to the Everyday Greatness page at barnabyhowarth.com.au or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube or LinkedIn. Thank you again for listening today, and thank you again, Jessica.